The British Touring Car season came to a thrilling conclusion yesterday. As is the case with the BTCC being so competitive, we are often treated to a brilliant finals day where everything is settled and it can, more often than not, go down to the last race of the season. And by last race, I mean the last race of the three. It's brilliant. I mean, last year is an exception to that rule though, because Sutton was so dominant. And I appreciate that this is a video that mostly appeals to my UK audience because watching the British Touring Cars is incredibly difficult outside of the UK. It's shown on ITV4, and you can watch online with ITV's free streaming service ITVX, but it's like trying to get US exclusive Netflix shows on the UK Netflix. It's just not possible. Try accessing ITVX outside of the UK and you're not going to be able to get on there. The BTCC is showing qualifying on YouTube these days, and it might be a step in the right direction for the series if they start showing the races on there too and then just geo-blocking them for people here. You know, how like IMSA does it on YouTube for those outside of the US, but they don't. It's probably because of contracts, but it's one way of getting more eyes on it. But anyway, it's a category of racing I've been championing for some time, and when the BTCC content came to R Factor 2, I kind of became a guy that got asked all the questions. But I love the British touring cars, and not because British bias. They're cars that you see on the roads, bombing it around the best circuits that the UK has to offer, and Thruxton. It's fast, it's frenetic, and you get an entire day's worth of racing for free on television. It starts at like 10:30 AM and it finishes just after 6, although it is punctuated by adverts for air fryers, over 50s life insurance, the RSPCA, some ex-cricket player with circulation issues, river cruises, pressure washers, and the guide dogs. Now the last one I can properly get behind because they're a charity that's quite close to us in this household, and those dogs, they're such good boys. But when those adverts aren't being played on a loop, you get 3 BTCC races, British F4, the Porsches, and others. Oh, the Legends stuff. They're insane. And because of things like the Success Ballast, well, I mean, it's not Success Ballast anymore, but Success Hybrid restrictions and reverse grids, you end up with some decent racing. Those who are faster and chasing a championship will have to fight their way through the field. I know some don't enjoy that sort of thing, but it's a good balance between sport and show. At least, I think so. And yesterday was just so much fun to watch and was edge of the seat stuff because Jake Hill went into race 3 just a single point ahead of Tom Ingram, who was chasing his second BTCC title. BMW versus Hyundai, front wheel drive versus rear wheel drive, and a bit of rain in the air as well. It should have been a tasty thing to watch, and it was. It was basically going to be winner takes all, and made even spicier before any of the festivities got underway because Hill and Ingram had gone to Brands Hatch equal on points. Hill won race 1, Ingram race 2, and it left just 1 point between them once all the bonus points had been added up for pole position, fastest lap and leading a lap. It's probably going to be labelled as one of the best finals days in recent memory, although there was a finals day 5 years ago which I think was even better just because of the amount of drama that was involved. Is it the best finals day of all time? Probably, but then again, there's a certain Scotsman who went for first that is probably higher up on people's tier list. But today, I've got the BTCC's Is That Glock moment, the time Colin Turkington snatched the title from, well, the jaws of defeat. Allow me to explain. So for this, we need to introduce the championship contenders. Northern Irishman Colin Turkington, who at the time the day started was a 3-time champion, and he was driving for BMW. Dan Camish was driving a Honda covered in Halford sponsorship, and Andrew Jordan was driving another BMW, and he was in 3rd position in the standings. Further back you have Josh Cook and Tom Ingram, the latter 2 drivers now fully established racers in the series. They seemed so young back then. Turkington had 297 points and was by far the favourite for the title, while Camish had 281. Jordan had 280, and then Cook on 263, and Ingram on 236. The final round of the season would take place at Brands Hatch in Kent, on the full Grand Prix layout that sees the cars go off round the back through the forest. The same track that the likes of Jim Clark, Nigel Mansell, Graham Hill, Jack Brabham, Ayrton Senna, Nelson Piquet, Niki Lauda, and a slew of other legendary names once raced on in Formula 1. It's one of the most famous racetracks in the world. The BTCC also uses the shorter Indy circuit, and the longer layout usually plays into the hands of the rear-wheel drive BMWs due to the nature of the course. But if it rained, then the advantage would swing back in favour of the front-wheel drive cars, like the Honda. Such was the advantage the rear-wheel drive cars had at Brands Hatch. Turkington was on pole despite carrying 70 kilos of success ballast into the first of the 3 races. In fact, the top 4 on the grid, Turkington, Sutton, Jordan and Tom Oliphant, were all rear-wheel drive, and Turkington, Jordan and Oliphant were all in BMWs, while Sutton was in a Subaru Evorg Estate. Not quite the Volvo, but it'll do. Camish, meanwhile, was only 12th. Race 1 didn't start well for Turkington. Brands Hatch is a bit of a weird one because pole position is on the right hand side of the circuit, nearest the pit wall, which is more of a traditional pole position rather than being on the side that has the racing line go directly over it. Which, I mean, at Brands Hatch it's a bit of a weird one anyway because that start-finish straight isn't exactly straight. It's a continuous list to the right and the racing line kind of straddles both sides. Not only that, the start-finish straight is slightly banked. Okay, not exactly banked in the NASCAR sense, but it's certainly off camber and it can get quite dirty. So if you're on pole and lugging 70 kilos of weight around with you, getting off the line is going to be difficult. It's going to be made even harder when you're in a rear-wheel drive car. Front-wheel drives might be able to pull themselves out of the dip. The long and short of it is that Turkington didn't get off the line well, and Sutton in the Evorg took the lead into turn 1. Although Ash almost misjudged the length of his car when cutting across Turkington, and it was like a cigarette paper's width between them. He did that at Donington last year, was it? And he wiped himself out of the race after only 400 yards or so. He wasn't damaged, but the radiator was filled with grass, so they had to pull him in before it overheated. Despite being 12th on the grid, Camish had started to make inroads up the order. By the end of lap 2, he was up to 8th, but then had to get more of a stomp on because Turkington had found some pace and managed to get past Sutton again and take back the lead, and he would get a bonus point for leading a lap in the race. So everything was still to play for the championship. Camish was bombing it up the field, but Turkington was still at the front, so Camish had to reduce the deficit as much as he possibly could. And this is where the drama of the BTCC starts to kick in. It's Netflix without the Netflix. Jordan took the fastest lap, but then the race had to be slowed to a crawl because of the safety car being deployed. Matt Simpson had buried his Ford Focus into the wall at Paddock Hill. Instead of stopping the race to recover the Ford and repair the barrier, the race continued behind the safety car, and 3 extra laps were added to the race. While under the safety car though, the rain came down. Now something to note about the BTCC if you're new to all of this is that pit stops can happen, they just tend not to. Drivers can be called in for meatball flags because bodywork is inevitably going to start coming off, especially the Napa Fords because their bodywork seems to be made of tissue paper, and tyre changes usually only happen for punctures or in this case, wet weather. BTCC tyres are racing slicks which at the time were made by Dunlop, but given the shortness of the races and the time taken to change a tyre, you're going to see risks taken. Some drivers will stay out hoping that the end of the race comes before the track becomes undrivable, and if the pace does drop off, you hope that the time lost in the pits is too much for the guys on the wets who now have the advantage to overhaul the gap. If you can follow me here. But none of the leading runners took to the pits, Turkington and Camish included. At the restart, Butcher got the better of Turkington and got himself into the lead, grabbing a bonus point for leading a lap. Camish, despite being in a front-wheel drive car, seemed to have more pace than Turkington and then got past him for 3rd place and started chasing down Butcher and Jake Hill. Camish started hunting down those 2 cars and got past Hill and then later got past Butcher to take the lead of the race, netting him a bonus point, because what do points make? Prizes. It could all come down to that single point at the end of the day. I mean, literally, at the end of the day. Further back, Camish's teammate Matt Neal was the leader of the wet tyre runners. Camish hadn't pitted but was somehow making the most of the conditions. Maybe because he was in a front-wheel drive car, the wheels are going to be doing the turning and the driving, so he could keep more heat in the driven wheels and the turning wheels because, well, they're the same wheels. Front-wheel drive racing cars are black magic to me. Those who can drive them on the sims can drive them. The likes of Dan Kell, Matt Richards and, well, I mean, they're just aliens. It's a joke. But anyway, Neil was able to start carving his way through the field, while also on the wets were Tom Chilton, Stephen Jelly, Aidan Moffat, Bobby Thompson, Adam Morgan, Josh Cook, Dan Rowbottom, Mark Blundell, Jason Plato, Michael Crease, and Rob Smith. Soon after those cars left the pits, Sam Osborne was spotted in a wall, but no safety car was called. No red flag was called either, and if the safety car had been called, then it would have meant the guys on the wet tyres would have been able to catch right up, and they really would have had an advantage once the race got going again. Matt Neal was absolutely charging. He came out of the pits in 16th, and by lap 16 he was up to 10th, and at the start of the final lap, lap 18, he got up to 6th. I'll give you a few moments to guess where he ended up by the end of that final lap. I'll just leave you for a second. You got a number? Good. Neil forced his way past Bushell and Chilton, who were also on the wets, and the next car in front of him was Turkington, who was now starting to struggle as the track was just a smidge too wet. If not for the safety car, then Turkington might have just got away with it. But that's the lottery of BTCC racing when you've got such short races and our lovely weather to contend with. The three cars on the wets passed Turkington round the back end of the circuit, but up ahead, Camish had managed to force his way to the front of the field and was ahead of Butcher and had managed to pull out a decent lead. And Camish was about to cross the line to take the win, and probably the most crucial result of his career. Neil got up to third after getting past Turkington, and Colin was now down to fifth. But Neil wasn't done there. He passed Butcher on the line to finish second. Now all he had to do was play rear gunner in race 2. Team Dynamics had played an absolute blinder with the wet weather tyre gamble. It was a race that was all over the place. At one point, the live point standings graphics showed that Turkington was going to be leaving race 1 with a 28-point gap to Camish, and looking like the fourth title was going to be sewn up pretty easily. If the race went as ITV was predicting, then all Colin would have had to have done is make sure that he came out of race 2 with a 23-point advantage, or 22-point advantage, depending on how many races he'd won versus Camish at that point. But as it was, Turkington ended race 1 with his gap in the standings shrunk to 7 points. 309 plays 302. Because of the way the point system works in the British touring cars, if the gap was 23 points after race 2, if Colin didn't finish race 3 for whatever reason, it meant that there was nothing that Camish could do. He would get 20 points for winning the race, he would get a point for leading a lap, and he'd get a point for the fastest lap as well if he managed to score all the available points, which is 22. Because the gap is 23, Colin's won. I mean, that's just how the points work. I mean, you're probably thinking, well, hang on, you basically are guaranteed 21 points, aren't you? Well, not necessarily, because you can be moved up and not having won a race if someone gets penalised. I don't make the rules. Race 2 then, and most of the grid gambled on the wet tyres. It was going to dry out over the course of the race, but the hope was it would be done before it dried out. And at the start, Turkington went from 5th to 2nd as he channeled his inner Jean Alesi and used his rear-wheel drive power to jump Butcher, Chilton and Neil like they were standing still. The only car ahead of him now was Camish, his championship rival. But going into Graham Hill Bend just 2 corners later, the ITV cameras were looking at an accident that was surely going to bring out the safety car. As they cut back to the leaders, Neil drilled the back of Turkington's BMW and spun him off. When Turkington rejoined the circuit, the safety car had been deployed, and he was stone dead last. Tim Harvey and David Addison on the commentary were immediately making comments about how it was a Halfords Honda that was involved, and how it would cause absolute mayhem, because the other Halfords Honda was one of the cars involved in the championship battle. The car that got spun out was the other car in the championship battle. I remember there being comments online at the time that Neil knew what he was doing and that he spun Turkington out to send him to the back with the safety car about to come out. You know, the usual stuff that the Barrys on Facebook love to rage about, like how they were raging about Jake Hill drawing number 6 for the reverse grid the other week and potentially giving him an advantage, and oh, it's cheating and he's not the real champion, Ingram's the real champion, and just shut up. Turkington pitted for some slicks, hoping to do the reverse of what Neil had done in race 1, but it didn't work. The track didn't dry out fast enough for him to take advantage later on into the race, and he still finished in 25th. Happily though for Turkington, despite him not scoring any points while Camish finished in 3rd, the overhauling in the points wasn't as bad as it could have been, so the gap had now swung so that Camish was now 8 points in front. In a post-race interview with Louise Goodman, Turkington seemed dejected but still had hope, while at the same time lamenting the fact that he'd been punted off the road by somebody who should have known better, as well as calling it a professional foul. For Colin to win the championship, it was still doable, but it was going to take a lot of work because Brands Hatch is not an easy place to overtake, and other cars weren't just going to move out of the way for him. Andrew Jordan, who was now 13 points off the title, jokingly said that Dan was now crapping himself as it was his to lose. Neil, meanwhile, was handed a 5-place grid penalty. Not that it would do much. And Jordan's comments are what we like to call in the business foreshadowing. So next up is race 3, the big finale. I've seen it 100 times and I'm getting tense and getting goosebumps just talking about it to you now. And I know what happens. Colin wasn't giving up. He was going to go out there and do whatever he could, which is one of his qualities as a driver. He'll drive mostly like Prost and take maximum points for the situation he's in, but when he has to, he'll put the pedal down and just go for it. But it was still going to be difficult. He somehow had to go from 25th position out of 30 cars, get up to where Kamish was, and then get into a position where he'd outscore him to the tune of 9 points. But what would help him is he'd have no ballast, while Kamish had 42 kilos on board and also had Andrew Jordan starting directly behind. It was on. But Colin did get some luck. Chris Smiley's car broke down on the way to the grid and they'd got it off the track before the final cars lined up on the grid, so no laps would be knocked off for having to do another formation lap. That was something that Colin really didn't need. He needed all the laps he could possibly get. But Kamish might look back on this and go, yeah, could you have just taken a couple of minutes longer at the back of the field and taken a lap knocked off, because that's all I needed. At the end of lap 1, Jordan and Sutton had got in front of Kamish, so Dan was now in 10th. But crucially, in behind, Turkington was up to 15th. He'd made 10 positions up from his starting place, most of those from just getting another epic launch off the line. But while Kamish would have been happy enough to sit behind Jordan given that AJ was 13 points back and him finishing one position ahead wouldn't be enough for the championship, and this being with Turkington so far back, Aidan Moffat had now taken quite the interest in the back of Dan's Civic, being so close at times that he could read the part number on the rear wing. Then Tom Chilton's shredded wheat Ford Focus ended up shredded in the outside wall somewhere, and Michael Caine, no not that Michael Caine, also went off, allowing Turkington 2 freebies to be up to 12th midway around lap 3. In front of him were Tom Ingram's Corolla, Aidan Moffat's Infiniti, and Kamish. On lap 4, Senna Proctor got served up by Cook at Stirling's and that gave Turkington 11th, but at the same time it shifted Kamish up to 9th, still 2 more positions to find. Happily though, Jason Plato was winning the race. On lap 5, the cars in the lower half of the points were gifted another freebie and Turkington was now in the top 10. But once again, Kamish had gained a spot too. If the race ended like this, Kamish was still the champion, but would extend the gap to 10 points. But from lap 6 onwards, the brakes on the Civic entering Paddock Hill seemed to be glowing red hot. On a Formula 1 car, this would be normal, but for these cars, it's really not a good sign. You could describe it as suboptimal. The front brakes on Kamish's car were incredibly hot, and the Corolla of Ingram and the BMW of Turkington were nowhere near the same sorts of temperatures. With just over half the race to run, it was going to be a concern, and by this point Kamish, Ingram and Turkington were running nose to tail. Things weren't exactly rosy on Turkington's end either, because the sun was going down due to it being October the 13th as it so happened, so my 29th birthday, and all the gunge from the track had been flicked up onto his windscreen, so he couldn't see much. If he used the wipers, he'd only end up smearing it all over the screen and making it worse. And these cars don't have washer bottles. Lap 9 now, and this 3-way scrap had become a 4-way scrap. Ollie Jackson in the Ford now led the train as Jordan had cleared him and cleared off, and all 3 behind were looking for a way through. Turkington was having a go at Ingram while Kamish wanted by Jackson, but nobody could get past anybody. And every time they cut to Turkington's onboard, the grime was getting worse and worse. But into Hawthorne Bend, Turkington finally got past Ingram and was now up the back of Kamish. If Turkington could get past Dancam, he needed to still overhaul him by more points than what he was getting. So if it was Turkington 7th and Kamish 8th, it would be 326 points for Kamish and 319 for Turkington. Turkington still had to find another 7 points from somewhere, so would have to finish 2nd to get them, or have the fastest lap and 3rd, and those cars were too far up the road to even begin to think about getting past. The only thing he could rely on is Kamish losing positions, so Ingram getting by and then others getting by, which would then leave Colin needing only 6 points, but he would still need to be 3rd, unless my maths fails me. On lap 12, Turkington finally got past, and crucially, so did Ingram, leaving Kamish down 2 places. Turkington did indeed need 6 more points, and on the next lap he gave Jackson a tap into Druids, but let him go, knowing that the position gained through contact would get him a penalty, and he really would be losing the title if that happened. But all this squabbling had allowed Adam Morgan to close up, and others, so the likes of Morgan and Jelly potentially getting past would be helping Turkington, because Jordan was just too far up the road, to the tune of about 7 seconds. With Jackson dispatched with, Turkington needed 5 more points, or have Kamish lose 5 more places. Kamish could lose 3, because the 4th car in that queue would be Matt Neal, and there was no way that Neal would be getting past. 2 laps to go, and it looked like that Kamish might just hold on. Braking for Hawthorne Bend on the very next lap, he lost the rear, possibly due to the overheating brakes. Camish was in a wall, and that was it. Turkington was the champion so long as he finished the race. It really was the BTCC's Is That Glock moment, because everybody was going, oh my god, that's Camish. What's Camish doing in the wall? What's happened there? It took a while for anybody to realise that it was Camish's Honda that was in the wall and not somebody else. Turkington nursed the car home over the final lap and crossed the line. The 10 points he got for finishing 6th from starting 25th was just enough, as he won the championship by 2 points from Camish. If he hadn't cleared Jackson, he would have still been okay, winning the title by just 1 point, but the 2 points swung it from 8 points behind to 2 in front, with 1.5 laps left to run. It was some of the most nail-biting racing I've ever seen. As best race weekends that I've ever watched go, it's definitely in the top 3. What the other 2 are, I'm not quite sure. Maybe that's a video for another day. But there is a great image from that afternoon, evening, whatever you want to call it, that has Turkington standing on the top of his BMW with his arms aloft to celebrate. And the colour in the sky is just beautiful. It's somewhere on the internet. I just wish I could use it in the video, but there's rules and regulations about that. The outpouring of emotion from within Colin's car and on the pit wall at West Surrey Racing was in stark contrast to the emotions at Team Dynamics. They were so close to a championship. Dynamics, that is. A lap and a half more and they'd have had it, but it was not to be. That's just racing. Turkington became only the second 4-time champion in BTCC history after that race, joining Andy Rouse, and they have since been joined by Ash Sutton. But it was a long day of racing with everything that you could possibly throw at it. It was full of highs and lows, oh-so-nears, weather, being biffed off the road. Like I said, it was Netflix without the need for Netflix. It was sport and entertainment at its absolute finest, and I'm getting goosebumps now talking about it. I don't know why. This race weekend was utterly phenomenal. And the last 2 laps are on the BTCC YouTube channel if you want to go and watch them. I highly recommend you do. The actual full race is probably somewhere on the internet. But those last 2 laps, I might go and watch them again. So with that, this has been the story of the gripping, and I mean gripping 2019 BTCC finale from Brands Hatch. If this has been an interesting look through the motorsport history books, then do like this video so I know a good job was done. And for more stuff like this, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else to do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the mad lads at Patreon for the continued support. And if you want to help support me at a more personal level, then a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. As well as memberships and super thanks if you just want alternative ways of keeping things running around here. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.